This new project of these great online videos and live streams that we're doing at Sandeman's for you guys from the comfort of your own sofa, and you can visit all over the world in English. If Spanish is your language and you're waiting for the Spanish videos, then don't worry, we've got plenty of those coming up as well. So thank you so much, guys. Don't forget as well, it's really great to see you engaging, commenting, liking and sharing. So if you do enjoy this tour, when we get to the end, don't forget to like, share with everyone, subscribe to our channel as well so you don't miss out on any of the future live streams that we've got coming up, and let's try and reach as many people as we can with these videos. Guys, if you really want to help out as well, my colleague right now is going to put a link in the comments section. It's super duper simple. You can just click on the link and it takes you straight to a page where you can donate as little or as much as you like. So €1, £1, every little helps. It's so much appreciated, guys, because it helps us tour guides get back to work after a very tough and bleak year. But also it helps us at Sandeman's to continue with these projects. It allows us to keep bringing you these great videos from all over the world. So thank you so much for doing that, guys. You can do it a little bit later on as well. I'll remind you when we get to the end of the tour. We'll also be answering questions, and I'll be reading your comments throughout the tour. So in just a few moments before we get going, and while we wait for other people to join as well, I'm going to introduce myself, tell you a little bit about me, and also about what we're going to see today. So in this time now, if you have any questions about the area that we're going to visit today, which is Covent Garden, about London in general, touristy stuff, if you're a bit nosy and you want to ask questions about me, that's absolutely fine. So if you go typing those in before we set off, I'll have a little look. I can answer some of your questions. And if you want to leave those throughout the tour as we go along, that's absolutely fine as well, because when we get to the end, we'll have another little moment where I'll be able to answer some more of your questions, okay? So like I said, I'll introduce myself before we set off. My name is Ellie. I'm an art historian. I'm currently also finishing some postgraduate studies in practical philosophy. Why on earth would you do that, you probably ask? I don't know. We'll see in a few years and I'll get back to you at how that's going. But no, I really enjoy it, as well as tour guiding, which I've done for about 6 years or so now. I first came to London about 7 years ago, and I moved here from Malaga, which is a smaller city in the south of Spain. The main reason I moved to London was because of the big recession in 2008. It hit Spain pretty hard, so finding work was very difficult, and working in what you enjoy or in your field was practically impossible. So I thought coming to the big city would be a great idea. I was sort of quite familiar with London. I knew it very well. My parents used to live here and I was actually born here, but I went over to Spain when I was very small. So I sort of spent many years coming and going between Spain and the UK. So I always knew really that I wanted to return to London and that there would be many more opportunities here for me. And indeed, throughout the years, I've had the chance to work on lots of different projects that I've liked, from archaeology, museum and gallery work, and of course tour guiding, which is a very rewarding job for me. I absolutely love it. Now, as an art historian, you might think that I spend all day just looking at paintings. I wish, what a dream. I do look at a lot of paintings and buildings, but for me, art history in general, it's all about the people, I would say. So whenever I'm researching anything, could be an article or an essay or content for a tour, whenever I'm reading about historical events, I find myself dreaming away about the people involved in the stories. I start thinking, who are they? What do they do? What do they get up to? What did they do for a living? What did they do for fun? And that's what we're going to do today as we wander around one of the most fascinating neighbourhoods in central London, Covent Garden. So we're going to take a walk through the centuries and we're going to discover how this area and its people evolved from a garden that belonged to the monks of Westminster Abbey through to an aristocratic neighbourhood, a hustling and bustling market, a theatre district, a centre of vice and deprivation, and in the Victorian period, an area so poor that it would inspire none other than Charles Dickens. So if you think that sounds great and you're ready to go, we will get set off in just a few moments, but shall I see if anyone's left any comments or questions before we get going? Let's have a little look. I've only got my gloves off so I can do this, otherwise I would have them on. It's quite cold today. All right, folks. So, let's see who's here. Oh, Julie asks, what's your favourite market to shop at, Ellie? Oh, that's a good question. I get asked that a lot on the tours as well. Definitely Brick Lane Market is my favourite. We're going to see a market here today, Covent Garden, but it's not really one of the more authentic ones. We'll see why in a moment. So I would say Brick Lane is definitely my favourite. Brick Lane is open every day, but the best day is a Sunday. There are more stalls on a Sunday. Brick Lane is in the East End. It's a great area, and it's one of my favourite markets because the food offer there is fantastic. You get food from all over the world, loads of vegan, vegetarian stuff as well, which is great. On a Sunday as well, they have stalls on the street where they sell all sorts of random things as well. So yeah, that would be my favourite. Camilla says, hi from Brazil. I love Covent Garden. That's great. You're going to enjoy the tour. Clara says, what is Christmas like in London? Christmas in London is amazing. I'm staying here for Christmas this year. I did last year as well. I absolutely love it because I'm a bit of a sucker for Christmas. I love everything Christmas. I'm obsessed. I put my decorations up in November and I take them down, well in January. So London is so full of Christmas spirit. You'll see a lot of decorations here today. So you've got lots of really great illuminations, like on Regent Street. It's very, very pretty. Usually, in COVID times, it's a little bit different this year, but usually you'd have ice skating, which is lots of fun as well. There are really great outdoor ice skating rinks, usually at the Tower of London or the Natural History Museum, very nice. Christmas shopping is a little bit stressful, so I don't tend to go to Oxford Street, but I really also enjoy going to lots of the shows as well. A little bit later on, we'll pass somewhere where I've got tickets for Christmas Eve, and I'll tell you a little bit about the sort of things that you can do at Christmas as well. Manuel asked, do you go often to Covent Garden? I do actually, because for the tours, this is usually for Sandeman's free tour, we set off from Covent Garden. So I'd usually be in Covent Garden almost every single day. So it's like a bit of a second home for me. Have we got time for another one? Miss the walking tour so much. We miss you guys as well, of course we do. I've got another one here of, is Covent Garden touristy? Yes. It is quite touristy. You'll see a lot of people here today, but we don't have a massive amount of tourists at the moment. So a lot of Londoners, I think this is my theory, are kind of coming to central London and the areas where usually they maybe stay away from because there's so many tourists at this time of year. And after lockdown and everything, I think a lot of people are sort of making the most and coming into these areas that maybe they'd sort of give a miss. But usually this area at this time of year would be so packed and full of tourists. So it is touristy, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not interesting, okay? It's one of the most fascinating neighbourhoods that we have in central London, as you'll see. It's got a really, really rich history of loads of interesting characters as well. And it's definitely a very beautiful place. So I always recommend the tourist to definitely come and check it out. Okay, I'm being told we can do another question. Let's have a look. Okay, so there's one here of best museum. What's the best museum in London to visit? Well, that's a bit of a personal question, I would say, a bit of a tricky question, because there would be my favourite museum to visit. So I think, though, what I always say when people ask, like, what order should I see the museums, because we have so many, I say the British Museum should always be at number one for sure, and then depending on your personal preferences, there are so many others. The British Museum has so many incredible artefacts from all around the world. I like to call it sort of history of humanity through the objects that we create, so you can really see some incredible things. It's just really not to be missed, the British Museum, so I would say that one I would put at number one. My personal favourite actually is one that you might not have on the list. I really like the Whitechapel Gallery. I always recommend it to people on the tours because it sort of always gets overlooked. It's a contemporary art gallery, but it's a really, really important one in London's history as well. It was opened very beginning of the 20th century to bring really great artwork, including Picasso, Jackson Pollock, David Hockney. They all had, David Hockney had his first show there as well. So it was meant to bring really great art to the people of the East End, and it's free. like all the other museums, but it usually has temporary collections instead of like a permanent collection that the other ones have. But I always say the Whitechapel Gallery is definitely worth the visit. Right, are we ready to go? Okay, awesome, great. So off we go, guys. Let's begin our adventure through the beautiful Covent Garden. Now we're gonna start in this area. Here's the station behind me as well. This is probably the area of Covent Garden that if you have been here before, you know best. And if you get told to come here, this is where you'll come. And maybe you won't sort of wander around or explore the streets surrounding the area, but don't worry, because that's what we're going to do today. Covent Garden, the name itself, is a transformation of Convent Garden, okay, referring to a vegetable garden that used to belong to the monks of Westminster Abbey. Now, if you're thinking, well, I've been here before, and Westminster Abbey, I remember, was a little bit far away from Covent Garden. I mean, you can walk, but it's sort of about a 20-minute walk or so away from here. Yes, so we think of it as a completely separate place, but Westminster Abbey was quite a large territory, of course, back then, because today, if you have visited the Abbey, which is beautiful, you've only visited what's left of it, which is the church. So the lands were enormous, and they reached all the way here. These territories belonged to the Abbey, but not forever, thanks to a king that you've probably heard of, Henry VIII, because he dissolves all the monasteries and he seizes the lands of the church. And so in 1536, the monks lose possession of these territories. A little bit later, in the 1550s, Henry's successor, Edward VI, he grants these lands to the first Earl of Bedford, a man called John Francis. This man was a Tudor minister and courtier, a very successful one. And so he gets these lands and he doesn't really do much with them for quite a long time. So it's difficult to imagine this area as just fields and pasture lands, but indeed for quite a while that's what they were, because the Earls of Bedford, the Russell family, they had other much more interesting lands and properties. So they just ignored this area for ages, until the 1630s. The fourth Earl of Bedford, he comes along and he builds himself a house on the other side by the Strand, and he thinks, it's time to spruce the area up a little bit. What he's really thinking is it's time to make some serious cash from this area. So he thinks, why not develop the area, build some fancy houses and attract the wealthy aristocrats. So to do this, he commissions one of the most renowned architects of the day, a man called Inigo Jones. Now, Inigo Jones was a real man of the Renaissance in the sense that he was very much inspired by the art and the architectural styles of Italy. And that's what he brings to Covent Garden when he designs, not Covent Garden Square, Covent Garden Piazza is the actual name of this area. Because what he's trying to emulate is an Italian style square, Italian style piazza. And in fact, if you have a look behind me at the Apple Store, now there's not many original buildings from Inigo's time, and indeed what is the Apple Store today isn't from the 17th century. This is a 19th century building, but it's emulating the sort of buildings that would have been here. So if you have a look at an engraving or a sketch of the area from before this building, you'll see that they're quite similar. So very classical style with the arcade for the shops that would have gone all the way around. Calling it piazza just meant it sounded a bit more fancy and fashionable because it was Italian, and anything Italian was quite fashionable. So fashionable that the name Piazza was recorded after the success of Covent Garden as quite a popular name for baby girls, which I think is really strange, and I think any Italian would find that very odd to call your child a square, but there you go. Now, the wealthy aristocrats moving in here, they needed somewhere to go to church, so that's what we're going to have a look at right now, and this building is Inigo Jones's building, so one of the very few original buildings that survive here in Covent Garden. Now, the landlord, Mr. Russell, the fourth Earl of Bedford, didn't really want to spend too much money on the church, okay? So apparently he said to Inigo Jones, look, don't make this thing any more elaborate than a barn. Inigo Jones, being a very renowned architect, has a reputation to keep, so he says, well, all right, But you shall have the finest barn in London, okay? And there it is just behind me, St. Paul's Church. So in keeping with the barn theme, Inigo has gone for a bit more of a rustic feel, a Tuscan style on the portico there. Let's go and get a little bit of a closer look. It's a little bit loud. Thankfully though, because it means that the street performers have returned to Covent Garden. So we've just come out of a lockdown here in London. As you can see, everyone's out and about doing their Christmas shopping, but also people that haven't been able to work or make a living for many, many months, like these guys who really, you know, their whole life is Covent Garden, are back out on the streets. So it's a little bit loud, but we're going to go through the arches here of what's also known as the Actors' Church. Now we're going to see some theatres in a moment as well. And it doesn't mean that St. Paul's was a theatre, although today they do show plays in the churchyard. But it was called the Actors' Church because, of course, the actors, stage crew in the area used to use it. Funerals of theirs were held here. And if you go inside, there are lots of plaques to commemorate the great actors of the day. Quite curious, you might think that this is the entrance to the church, but no. And in fact, just have a quick look here. And you might think that this is the door, but this is actually a fake door. And this wall here is the altar. So strangely, the church is the other way around. So the entrance to the church is all the way at the other end. And if you want to get in, you've got to go in through the side street round the back. So I'm wealthy, I live in Covent Garden, brilliant, I can come to the church. What else can I do around here? Well, just outside the church, I could also come in the 17th and 18th centuries especially to a political hustings. What's that? Well, these were gatherings where I could come and I could watch a politician give a speech. These were also ways to elect officials, and you come and you gather in crowds, just like the one that you have today. Food would be provided, a lot of alcohol would be provided, so these things were a lot of fun for some people and got quite rowdy. So you sort of stand here and anything that the politician said, you could just put your hand up to agree or disagree. Fights often broke out though, so it could be a little bit dangerous. It's a little bit more civil today. But the wealthy aristocrats are not going to stay in this area forever. And behind me we have the reason why. The market, beautiful market today. You can see the Christmas decorations every year, gorgeous. So they've got the giant mistletoe hanging there with the big lights, really, really nice. But the first market here, well, probably people have been trading here, you know, since the 15th century or so, but the first recorded market was in the 1650s. Got so popular that Charles II granted a charter to the market in 1670, but not many people lived here yet. So it's still wasn't very, very busy. But it began to grow and grow and grow, mainly because of two big events in London's history that you might have heard of. The Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London of 1666. Both of these catastrophes managed to avoid Covent Garden completely, so that meant that Londoners were flocking to the West End and they were settling down here, so the area became bigger and bigger and more overcrowded. If we fast forward to the 19th century, the Victorian period, this market was, you might describe it as chaotic, okay? Wandering through, it would be so loud and hustling and bustling, colourful. It must have been quite incredible. But it started to spill out all over, okay, into the neighbouring streets. And the stalls were not very good. They were very ramshackle sort of things. So in the end, they tore it all down and they decided to build a proper market building, which is what we've been walking around, what you've been seeing. And this was finished in 1830 by the architect Charles Fowler, who again has gone for a beautifully classical inspired building. It's very simple, very practical, but I think very, very beautiful. So when they do this, they build permanent stalls for the first time. They put proper rents, so they try to regulate it a little bit more, but it doesn't stop the market from growing. In the end, they have to move it. Not until 1974 though, and that's when Covent Garden Market is moved south of the river down to Battersea. Now, the Covent Garden community are a very lovely bunch of people, a very special community as well, because they always come together to fight for their causes, especially if it's to do with the history and the heritage of the area. So when the market did move in the 70s, believe it or not, they wanted to tear down all the beautiful historical market buildings. So the community got together and they fought and they won, which is why when you visit London, you can visit this beautiful building still today. I was saying before that it's not really what you'd call an authentic market in the sense that, you know, it's not the old fruit and veg market that it once was. It's more of a sort of boutique shopping centre or shopping area. Doesn't mean to say it's not worth a visit, still is. But if you want a bit more of a proper market, you've got the one behind me, which is really interesting as well. It's called the Jubilee Market. Building itself is from the early 20th century. The market was closed for a while, but it reopened in 1987. It was opened by the Queen and it was renamed Jubilee Market. It's thought that this market behind me is the only market in London that's actually run by the traders themselves, because they were, well, the market was going to close, it was bankrupt, and they got together and they saved the market, which is quite incredible. And they have 3 different markets. So they have a normal one, arts and crafts, and antiques market as well. And you might have noticed that on the front, as we came around, right on the front of Covent Garden, there's a big sign that says Punch and Judy. The Punch and Judy pub is downstairs at the bottom of the market, and in fact it's here, the Jubilee Market, that the first performance of Punch and Judy was recorded by the famous diarist Samuel Pepys in 1662. And if you're thinking, what's she on about? What on earth is Punch and Judy? Because if you're not British, I don't expect you to know what that is at all. It's a very strange sort of show that is inspired by the Italian Commedia dell'arte. And basically it's a puppet show, okay? And it involves Mr. Punch and his wife Judy. And then there's usually a series of characters that interact with Mr. Punch and fall victim to his very unique brand of slapstick comedy, which is basically him hitting them over the head with a stick. And if you think, who would watch that? Don't judge too harsh, okay? Because we've just come out as well in the 1660s from 11 years of Puritan rule by Oliver Cromwell, and Charles II has just reopened all the theatres. So maybe you can sympathise a little bit, okay? You've come out of lockdown and you can go out again and you can do stuff, so maybe you would watch anything as well, even puppets hitting each other with sticks. Punch and Judy isn't really something that's very popular anymore, although I have seen it here and there, but something that is still popular comes from the same inspiration, the Commedia dell'arte, pantomime. Okay, well, we'll carry on walking a bit this way. Again, I'm not really going to go into explaining that, because I found that when I try to explain what pantomime is to non-British people, it's impossible. Okay, it's just not possible. So I would say next time you come to London, go to a pantomime, because at Christmas time they are very, very popular. All I can say is it's a type of show. Just go, okay? You have to go. Now the area starts to change when the market starts to expand a lot. The people start to change, because with the market we've also got the theatres as well. The nightlife is quite renowned here. You've got drinking dens and gambling houses and taverns and coffee houses and brothels. It's a bit much for the wealthy aristocrats. They want their peace and quiet. They like to come here to party, okay? But they want to live here, so they start to move out. And it starts to enter really that period that I commented of vice and deprivation. So a sort of period of decadence, if you will. And the poverty sort of spills out as well onto the neighbouring Seven Dials district, which we'll go and have a look at as well in just a few moments. Coffee houses were a staple of London life. Now you might think, yeah, but everyone drinks tea in Britain. True, we love tea, okay, we drink a hell of a lot of it, but it wasn't always so, because coffee was a lot cheaper than tea. Especially back in the 17th, the 18th centuries. So coffee was what you drank. Tea was a bit more of a niche thing for very wealthy. So coffee houses were not only where you went to drink your coffee, but they were also where you would go to socialise and maybe engage in political and literary debates as well. Sometimes though, especially in this area, they could also be fronts for brothels. So that was quite common. You could meet the lady in the coffee house, and then you would have a chat, and then you'd go off to conduct business elsewhere. But some of them were genuinely you know, these, which we're going to have a look at now. Like I said, areas. Jericho's just showing you, oh, that's nice, I hadn't noticed that before, the lovely Christmas decorations here at Covent Garden. You can see super busy of people coming to do their Christmas shopping. Like I said, I find it a bit stressful to come and do Christmas shopping of any kind, or shopping of any kind. I find quite stressful. So usually I might go to the markets maybe to do my bits of Christmas shopping as well. And in fact, this morning in my neighbourhood, the neighbours themselves had set up stalls from their own front yards to sort of gather a bit of money for the schools as well in the area, which was really nice, and it felt very Christmassy, everyone getting into the Christmas spirit. So coffee houses, there's one that you will recognise behind me. Not many literary minds are going to be cultivated in here today. Maybe they are, I'm not sure, but once they were, because where this Starbucks is, this used to be a place called Buttons. It was a coffee house, but then it was turned into a literary hub by a man called Joseph Addison, who was the co-founder, along with Richard Steele, of a magazine you might have heard of called The Spectator. So this became the place to go. So the likes of Jonathan Swift, for example, artist William Hogarth, they were regulars here at this coffee house. And anything they said, any opinions they have, whatever they were talking about, this became public opinion because it made its way into the pages of The Spectator, but also The Guardian and The Tatler as well. Now, I mentioned Puritans and Charles II. So like I said, the Puritans had been in charge, Oliver Cromwell, for 11 years. He was a bit of a killjoy, really, a bit of a party pooper, and closed all the theatres. So basically banned fun, okay, banned Christmas as well. So Charles II was known as the Merry Monarch, and when he's restored to the throne in 1660, one of the most popular decisions that he makes is he reopens the theatres. He also allows women to act on the stage for the very first time as well. So not only theatres that were closed down were reopened, but new theatres were built as well. So in 1663, he orders the construction of a theatre here in Covent Garden, a theatre royal known as the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, which we'll just go and get a little bit closer to. And this is the oldest still running theatre site in the whole of London. It also had a very special patent, and we'll just stand here so it's a little bit safer, and you can see it there just behind me. And this patent meant that this was one of the only theatres in London, there were only two, that were allowed to perform spoken word drama. Now that didn't mean that everybody else complied, basically that was ignored, but it did make this theatre a little bit special. Also, it's a theatre royal. That's not the original building, because like most buildings, especially theatres in London, it's burnt down several times throughout its history. So this particular one is from 1813. Another theatre is set up just next door, although a little bit later, in 1732. And this too is a theatre royal. It's known as the Theatre Royal Covent Garden, or just the Covent Garden Theatre. The competition was really fierce between these two, because when the Covent Garden Theatre is open, it's given the very same patent. So we'll go and have a little look at this one. It soon became apparent though that at the Covent Garden Theatre, there was a preference for a specific type of performance, opera, because the building that we're going to see now is, and has been since 1892, the home of the Royal Opera House, and it performs throughout the year opera and ballet. So I said earlier, when we were sort of talking about things to do in Christmas in London, that I had tickets for Christmas Eve, because it's amazing to come here around Christmas time and watch the ballet. Usually the Nutcracker, of course, is the most Christmas of all the ballets, and that's usually what they have on. So they reopened the other day when we finished the lockdown, and so the ballet is back on. They don't have much going on at the moment. Most of the stuff is online, but you're still able to come and get tickets to see the Nutcracker, and it's very cheap. Like, I always recommend as well when people come on the tours, and I mention opera and ballet, and sometimes they look at me a bit like, opera and ballet, thinking, you know, it's very elitist or it's super expensive, but it's not so, okay? There are tickets for £5 at the Opera House, okay? The same as Shakespeare's Globe Theatre is another one that I always recommend. You get tickets for a £5. It's brilliant, and it's lots of fun. I really, really enjoy it. And such a beautiful building. Again, not the original building. It's been refurbished many times over the years, 19th century, 20th century, and even 21st century as well. Now, the theatre lot are a very eccentric bunch, essential as well to life here in London, especially in what we call the West End, this area, Theatreland, Covent Garden. So yes, eccentric. The manager of this theatre back in the 1700s, John Rich, he came up with a bit of a weird gentleman's club, a society club, a private members only club called the Sublime Society of Beef Steaks. That's exactly what it sounds like, okay? So these guys thought that a beef steak was a very patriotic symbol of Britishness. Sure. So what they did is they'd get together and they'd basically eat lots of beef with lots of potatoes and loads of booze, and they thought that was brilliant. And you think, well, who on earth would join that club? Loads of people, okay, including Samuel Johnson, William Hogarth, even the Prince of Wales in the 18th century was a member of the Sublime Society of Beefsteaks. Does it still exist today? Kind of. There is still a beefsteak club in London that's inspired by that original very strange society that was set up here at the Covent Garden Theatre. Also, we're getting the very first stars of the stage back when the theatres are reopened in the 1600s. The most famous of those was a lady called Nell Gwynne. You might have heard of her. Nell Gwynne was born maybe in Covent Garden, we're not exactly sure, but she definitely was brought up here sometime between 1740 and 1750. Nell Gwynne started off her career as what was called an orange girl. So these were very young girls who were very sort of provocatively dressed that would work outside and inside the theatres, and they'd sell oranges, obviously, and other candied fruits and sweets and things like that to the theatre goers. But she was quite a character, so she caught the attention soon enough of the theatre company, and soon, aged 14, she was very funny, but she was incredibly witty. Samuel Pepys called her Pretty Witty Nell, and she had to be. Ooh, she had to be as well, because the crowds were very rowdy in the 1600s, so you'd have to deal with a lot of heckling. So she knew how to hold her own. But she's famous for another reason as well. She was also known as Cinderella, kind of similar to Cinderella, who has a very rags to riches story, because she became the most popular mistress of King Charles II as well. So she was really the first sort of it girl, society girl, real celebrity that we can talk about of the day as well. And she had scores of fans all over London. The people absolutely loved her as well. Now, the theatres, of course, made up a pretty solid client base for another one of Covent Garden's most successful businesses, you might say, or trades. Prostitution. Okay, so there were different types of prostitutes. They came in all shapes and sizes. So I'll share with you a little bit of the lingo of the day as well for the different sort of street workers as well. So you had what were known as the flash molishers. So they were the sort of lower class girls. There were then the spells, and these were the ladies who would wait outside the theatres, and their clients were the sort of more upper class theatre goers themselves. There were what were known as the boards, or the bagno owners. So bagno is Italian for bath, and it's because they actually owned baths, and that would be where they'd take their clients. And they would also poach girls, recruit girls known as nymphs, very young girls, off the streets as well. There were also the flower girls. So flower girls you could see everywhere around Covent Garden, and some just genuinely sold flowers. They were known as waifs, just looking to make a few extra pennies. But then there were also the flower sellers that doubled up as street workers as well. So when it went dark, they continued their trade well into the night. So flower seller or flower girl was another name that you might use for prostitute in the area as well. If you were visiting Covent Garden and you were looking for a lady, then you might try and find a copy of the Covent Garden Ladies. And this was a book, or rather a booklet, that was published every year around this time, around Christmas time, and it was a very detailed list of all the prostitutes that worked in the area, along with their appearance, with how much they charge, their experience, and their skills. Okay, so a bit of a strange booklet, but very, very popular, you can imagine as well. Now, although a lot of women did this, and maybe for those who sort of had very upper class clients, they might be living sort of life of glamour almost. Of course, it was a very, and still is, very dangerous trade, and not always very glamorous, because you can imagine it was very, very easy to contract any number of sexually transmitted infections and diseases in those days as well. I mentioned William Hogarth a few times because he has a really great series of engravings and illustrations that really depict this era very well. And he has one called Marriage à la Mode. And in one of the pictures, there's a gentleman, an aristocrat, who's gone with his young mistress, who's probably like at least half his age. And they've gone to a quack or a doctor to seek out a cure for syphilis. Now, syphilis was fatal, and the cure for syphilis was not found until the beginning of the 20th century. And in the picture, you can see them as well. And they're going to buy some tablets, and those were mercury pills, because for many years, until the 19th century, mercury was thought to be the cure for syphilis. It was all that was given. So either you died from syphilis or you died from mercury poisoning. Now we're spilling now, just like in the 19th century, into the area of Seven Dials. So we've come out of Covent Garden and we've come into an area that in the 19th century, in the Victorian period, was incredibly, incredibly poor. People were coming here looking for cheap accommodation. The market was attracting a lot of casual workers. The reason the lodgings here were so cheap was because they were the original 17th century buildings and they weren't built to last. Okay, so they were falling to bits. It's very overcrowded. The living conditions were horrific, and this became one of the great slums of London. Now, Charles Dickens, the novelist, was a man who loved to visit a slum. He had a bit of a strange fascination with coming and seeing, sort of morbid fascination, you might say, but they would inspire great novels. Oliver Twist or Nicholas Nickleby, for example. Any of his novels, or maybe you've seen some stage or film adaptations of some of them. What would be your favourite? Coming up to Christmas as well, my favourite is definitely the classic Christmas Carol. I don't know if you know the story, but basically it's about a miserly old moneylender called Ebenezer Scrooge, who he doesn't really get Christmas. He doesn't understand the message behind it or the meaning of it. So on Christmas Eve, he's visited by three spirits, three ghosts, and they take him on a bit of a journey to discover what Christmas really means. And it's got a very happy ending. At the end, he turns his life around and he discovers the true meaning of Christmas. I told you that I was a sucker for Christmas, so I love every single year. I make sure that I see at least one or two adaptations of A Christmas Carol, or I'll reread it. It's a very short novel as well. And all over London, you'll see lots of stage productions of that very classic tale. It's absolutely brilliant. So we're coming through, again, nowadays you can see it's a very pretty area. It's also quite sort of a boutique-y, niche kind of shopping area. But back in the 17th and 18th centuries as well, it would have been full of gin shops. Now, London has many gin palaces today. You come to London, you want to have a gin and tonic. It's sort of seen as quite a sophisticated beverage. Would you agree? Do you like a gin and tonic? But it wasn't always so, because when gin was introduced in the late 17th century, it was sweet, it was strong, and best of all, it was very, very cheap. So from when it was introduced, there began a sort of period of around 50 years that was known as the gin craze. It basically means that people went mad for gin. London was, you might say, drowning in gin. It's thought that London had around 1,500 gin distilleries by the 1730s, and around 7,000 establishments sold gin. The average person in England drank about 10 litres of gin per person per year. Now, I said it was strong, but it was also very cheap, so that meant that it was very accessible even for the poorer classes. Of course, people living around here, they're already very malnourished, bodies were very, very damaged by this massive consumption of gin as well. Again, to reference William Hogarth, seems like I do love the man. He has another really famous engraving called Gin Lane. Check it out because it's thought to be one of these streets, or if not, St Giles Rookery, which is the slum that would have been just next doors. We're coming though into one of my favourite and secret spots of Covent Garden, Neal's Yard, and also very colourful. Neal's Yard was named after the man that built the area, who was in charge of the building of this area, Thomas Neal, back in the 1600s. Realise why the area is actually called occultism, and you can see that it kind of keeps its very alternative vibe here today as well. Let's get in the middle where we can have a little look at it. It's so beautiful. But this area was going to be destroyed. In the 19th century, it was very run down, but that lasted well into the 60s and 70s. And in the 70s, a man called Nicholas Saunders, he was looking for a place to live, a cheap place to live close to Soho. And he saw that this whole area had come up on the market, the whole yard, and it was an absolute bargain because it was about to be demolished. So he bought it and he opened a whole food shop. Now, this man, Nicholas Saunders, had come from Christiania in Copenhagen. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's a pretty famous hippie commune. So he brought with him what he'd learnt, and this whole food shop became a community, and it grew. And you can see today that it still keeps its village-like feel, and all the shops and businesses here, they all still have an ethical sort of background to them. And if we have a look, this is also a really great cafe, vegan cafe, the Wild Food Cafe. But if you just have a look by the window, a bit further up, we can see one of those famous blue plaques. So anytime you see a blue plaque in London, go and have a look, because it tells you something interesting about the building. And there you can see, I'm sure you recognise, Monty Python. So Monty Python had their recording, animation and editing studios in this building here. What would be your favourite Monty Python sketch, and which one of the Monty Pythons is your favourite? I really love watching them. I rewatch them again and again. We're going to have a little look at a piece of modern street art now as well, just before we go. Any other questions as well? In just years old, she's been hailed as the female version of Banksy, but I don't like that. I think she's. But you can see why, because she has a style that's quite similar to Banksy's, with the sort of stenciling and the satirical sort of messages. She's a piece that she had out a few years ago where Theresa May and Donald Trump are dancing, but like in the film La La Land, and it's called Live. This one, like I said, I think it's from 2017. It's Princess Diana, and she's coming down, she's sort of dressed as Mary Poppins. She's magically coming down to visit You've got Prince George there as well. So she was the side there. You've got something very typical that she would probably say. You can be as naughty as she was dating at the time of Get Caught. And on the bag there, she's got a bag from Harrods, and that's a little nod to Jodie Al-Fayed, who now to the end of the tour, the Seven Dials, and we'll be able, like I said, to see why it's called the Seven Dials. But like I said, the man who was in charge of the building of this area, the development of the area, was an MP called Thomas Neal. He received the land off William III in the 1690s, and he wanted to copy Covent Garden a little bit because it had been very successful. So he also wanted to attract those wealthy aristocrats, just as Russell had done, the Earl of Bedford. So he builds this area, and to also maximize the profit, he makes all the sections triangular. So when we get to the middle here, we're going to see that 7 streets converge all off like this, like a star. So when you look at it on Google Maps, it does look very pretty. It's like a star. But he didn't do that for it to look pretty on Google Maps. He did that to create triangular sections so he could squash as many houses as possible into those sections so he could maximize the profit from the rent. And I'm going to turn around so that you can see coming up, you get a nice view of the sundial, which is why it's called 7 dials. There's 7 streets, there are 6 faces on the sundial, and the 7th being the column itself. So he contracted a man called Edward Pierce, who was a really famous stonemason of the time, to build this monument, which was the centerpiece, the decorative centerpiece of his new district, the 7 dials. So Thomas Neal, just like the Earl of Bedford, really thought that their areas were going to become some of the most fashionable addresses in London. Yes, they were for a time, but you've seen throughout this walk that it didn't really go according to plan. However, these, to me, are some of the most fascinating and interesting areas, stories and characters in the whole of London, and they attract millions of visitors every single year. So guys, just before we finish up, I'm just going to have a look and just see if you've got any more questions or comments for me as well. Let's have a look. Sandeman's tours are the best. Lovely. Greetings from Dallas. Thank you very much. There's a question here of what is the most interesting period in London's history? Well, that's a tricky question as well. Again, it's quite personal. I think the Victorian era is very, very interesting. I always end up talking quite a lot about the Victorian era, I think because we have a lot of remnants, of course, of this era, because it wasn't that long ago in London. And it's very fascinating. We've got Charles Dickens who sort of leaves us that image of the Victorian era as well. But I think it's most interesting because it's an era, I like to call it, of great contrast. So on the one hand, you've got the sort of glitz and glamour of the high Victorian society. You've got the British Empire with Queen Victoria at its highest peak. But then on the flip side of that, you've got, you know, the stuff that we've come talking about, these slums and these scenes of extreme poverty as well. So big contrast in the Victorian era. It's also an era of great social reform. We've got revolutions bubbling as well, and all sorts of exciting stuff going on in London. So yeah, I would say that one, but of course medieval period is always fun to talk about, isn't it? Let's see if you've got anything else for me. What do I miss about Spain? I miss lots of things about Spain. I always visit. It's been a bit hard for me, obviously, this whole period of lockdown and everything, because I haven't actually been to Spain coming up to a year now, which is probably the longest that I've ever gone for without visiting. Obviously, visiting my family has been quite tough. I haven't seen them yet. So usually I'd go sort of 2-3 times a year or something like that, make sure I get to the beach. So lots of Spanish people say the weather doesn't bother me too much in London because it's not as bad as you might think, or at least compared to other parts of the UK. But I do miss, when it's summer, just being able to go down to the beach would be nice. I miss a bit more of the laid back feel. Maybe London's quite busy and on the go, which I like as well, but sometimes it's nice to sort of slow it down a little bit and just chill out. Curiously, I miss breakfast there, and that's really weird, and it's such a silly thing, but where I'm from in Andalusia, we have a very simple but very delicious breakfast, which is just toast with this sort of pureed tomato and olive oil and salt. It's the most simple thing, but even though I try to replicate it, I can't. So I miss that. It's very silly. It's also very cheap. So yeah, I would definitely miss that. Have we got time for one more? Okay. Let's have a look. What's your favourite character of the Victorian era? Oh, that's so difficult. Wow, there are so many, aren't there? So many great characters to talk about. I think Charles Dickens is, I'm going to say he's my favourite, but off the top of my head we've been talking about him because he's very controversial. I wouldn't say I like him because he's a very strange man and quite a harsh man and not a very pleasant one, but I quite like talking about very controversial characters as well. And of course he's left such a great amount of literary works as well. The Charles Dickens Museum is also one of my favourite museums of London as well. I'm sure there are more that if I could sort of sit down and think, would probably be a better one, but definitely he's quite controversial and it's interesting to talk about for sure. All right, folks. Well, we've reached the end of the tour and I really, really hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed walking through Covent Garden with me and Seven Dials and discovering this area or rediscovering it, revisiting it. I know that a few of you have left comments saying you miss London and we really can't wait to have you back and back on the tours as well. So make sure when you come back to say hello to me and tell me that you were watching as well. That would be great. And guys, like I said at the beginning, if you still haven't done so yet, you can still click on that link if you've enjoyed the tour. And from €1, £1, okay, as little or as much as you want, it's really, really greatly appreciated. It just means that we can continue to bring you these tours and to bring you these videos. So thank you so much for doing that, and please don't forget to like, to share this with anyone that you might think is interested, to subscribe to our channel as well so that you don't miss any of the upcoming tours that we have. Remember, in English and also in Spanish as well. So guys, I will see you next time. I hope very, very soon. Big kiss, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and I'll see you later.